Life's fragility becomes starkly evident when we confront the most excruciating ways to die. Across history and contemporary events, certain deaths stand out for their unparalleled intensity of pain and suffering. Each account below represents a harrowing combination of physical agony, psychological terror, and in some cases, human mistake or deliberate cruelty. Welcome to Scary True. Today we will look into 5 of the most excruciating ways individuals have faced death, stripping away any illusions of mercy. In the calendar year 2012, the seafood processing plant in the city of Santa Fe Springs, California, witnessed a heinous workplace disaster that occurred in October. The victim, Jose Molina, a 62-year-old employee, had worked at Bumblebee Foods for years, undertaking the fairly repetitive but essential roles common in food processing industries. On this particular day, his task was to put pallets of canned tuna into an industrial oven, a giant apparatus that bakes the food at very high temperatures to kill bacteria. When Molina was operating the equipment, it stopped, and the chain mechanism inside the oven got damaged. Probably because of the need to stick to production schedules, he went inside the oven without informing his colleagues. Unaware of Molina's presence, another worker who assumed she had left, locked the oven door and started the machine. It only took a few moments. What should have been a normal work session turned into a disaster. The oven, which can heat up to an incredible 270 degrees Fahrenheit, began its process. Being confined in the sealed chamber, Molina was to go through an inconceivable experience. First, heat stimulated receptors in the skin layer, and the result was that nerves transmitted signals of pain to the head. But the heat was not only on the skin, it went deeper. The heat coagulated the structural proteins in his muscles. It denatured the enzymes in his vital organs. In other words, he was slowly being cooked alive from within his skin. Other researchers and doctors who have investigated similar incidents say that the feeling is akin to burning, choking, and drowning all at once. Just the pain of such a situation is hard to even imagine. Molina did not die a swift and painless death. Specialists believe that death from boiling water can take several minutes depending on the heat in the area of the body that is exposed to boiling water. At this time, the body experiences a series of physiological dysfunctions, which include severe thermal injuries, shock, and cardiovascular compromise. After the incident, Bumblebee Foods faced a lot of legal and financial consequences. The company, as well as 2 of its managers, was accused of several violations of workplace safety laws. Studies showed that safety procedures were not being followed at all. For example, workers entering high-risk zones without having to report to someone else. Bumblebee eventually agreed to pay $6 million in penalties, one of the highest fines in California for workplace safety violations. On a pain scale, such a death is rated around 105 points, making it among the most excruciating. Jose Molina's sad story is a grim illustration of the deadly dangers that are still present in working environments of industries that fail to practice strict safety measures. Let's remind ourselves of the case of Loretta Pickard, a 76-year-old woman who died on November 23, 2018, in Polk County, Florida, to appreciate the frailty of life as well as the effects of bureaucracy. Loretta, a surgical patient who was recently discharged from the hospital, was left alone at home when the house caught fire. The events of her death describe the horror of burning alive and the chain of events that contributed to her death. Because of her medical condition, Loretta was unable to move around her house quickly without help. When the house was suddenly filled with smoke, she had to dial 911, and her voice on the line was weak and shaky due to fear. She cried for assistance and kept on asking if there were firemen that were on their way. In the call recording, she laughed nervously at some point, which was a desperate effort to stay strong in a virtually unsolvable situation. This emotional shot depicts the deep helplessness she faced when waiting for help, which came very late. Being burned alive is considered one of the most painful ways of passing on. First, the skin's nerves are exposed to extreme heat, causing unbearable pain as they become damaged. As the fire progresses, nerves are burnt and the patient feels numb, but the injury goes much deeper than that. This situation is worsened by the superheated air and toxic fumes that burn the respiratory system and make it almost impossible to breathe. Thirdly, victims breathe in smoke with a high content of carbon monoxide, which in turn lowers the oxygen level in the victims' bodies, thus increasing their pain. Being tormented psychologically can be just as horrible as being physically tortured. And sadly, Loretta had to endure both. Confinement, the certainty of dying, and witnessing a slow disappearance of hope are all torturous mind conditions. The cries for help she recorded, which are interrupted by coughing and crackling fire, show how helpless she must have been as the fire ravaged her home. It was a challenging day for emergency responders. Loretta resided in a rural area, and as a result, the fire department had to travel on bumpy country roads to get to her house. This time, firefighters were able to come, but they came too late to save her. Englehart's last call with his wife, Loretta, lasted 20 minutes before the line went dead, marking the moment the fire reached her. Some sources argue that the dispatcher's guidance was inadequate and failed to offer the advice Loretta needed to survive. Furthermore, the fire chief said that the firefighters tried to enter the home to save her life, but the evidence showed that they never tried to do so. Loretta's death, which was 108 points on the pain scale, raised important questions about problems in the emergency services. It provides a rather sad reminder of the need for quick intervention, better direction from dispatch, and better safeguards for vulnerable populations. June 11, 1963, marked a day that residents of Saigon, the then capital of South Vietnam, were to stage a historic protest. Thich Quang Duc, a 67-year-old Buddhist monk, set himself on fire, and as a result of his barbaric protest, he became an embodiment of a strong-willed people fighting against oppression. This event was no accident. It was deliberately planned to highlight the suffering of Buddhists in South Vietnam under the oppressive rule of President Ngo Dinh Diem. Religious tension was rife in South Vietnam in the months preceding this event. Diem's government was mainly Catholic, and therefore it discriminated against Buddhists, even though they were the majority in the country. These were in areas like banning the use of the Buddhist symbol during the veneration of the Buddha's birthday, also known as Vesak. The conflict escalated to the worst point on May 8, 1963, when government forces attacked a Buddhist protest in Hue and killed 9 civilians. This massacre made the Buddhist people look for ways of making the international community hear their plight. This oppression was what Thich Quang Duc responded to when he burned himself alive. He and other monks laid down strategies for the protest in detail. On the morning of June 11th, Quang Duc went in a car to a crowded crossroad near the Cambodian embassy. He stepped out of the vehicle along with 2 other monks, with a cushion, a container of gasoline, and a box of matches in hand. Quang Duc then nonchalantly sat cross-legged on the street in the lotus position, a form of meditation. As monks and nuns surrounded him, one of the attendants drenched the gasoline on the body of Quang Duc. Without hesitation, the man struck a match, and he was consumed by the fire. Eyewitnesses, including Western journalists like Malcolm Brown, who took the photo of the event, said that Quang Duc did not stir as the fire enveloped him. His face was still impassive, and he did not make even one sound of pain. People were amazed by his calmness during the unbearable pain of being alive and burnt. This act was not meant to be an act in itself, but as a cry for change. In his suicide note, Quang Duc called for equal rights for all religions and an end to the persecution of Buddhists. His death caused an international uproar and brought condemnation of Diem's regime and the mobilization of the global society. The incident was as spiritual as it was political. His death highlights the suffering of humanity, while also showing the strength of belief. To this day, he is venerated as a martyr for religious freedom, and his image is a constant symbol of the price that has to be paid for justice and equality. The case of Harry Daghlian is still a vivid example of the consequences of radiation sickness. Daghlian was born in 1921 and was a bright and ambitious young physicist whose career put him in the center of one of the most important programs in the history of the world, the Manhattan Project, which was aimed at creating the atomic bomb during the Second World War. Unfortunately, his work with nuclear materials resulted in his death, making him one of the first victims of a criticality accident. On August 21, 1945, that is, within days of the 2 bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Daghlian was at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. His job entailed conducting experiments on a plutonium core, which later on was famously referred to as a demon core because of the several disasters that occurred with it. Daghlian was trying to determine the critical mass of the core by building a reflecting wall of tungsten carbide bricks around it. These bricks were used to bounce back neutrons into the plutonium to make it more reactive. In the course of the experiment, Daghlian inadvertently dropped one of the bricks on the core, and set off an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. This prompt criticality led to an emission of neutron radiation. While he did this, he managed to stop the reaction by knocking the brick off the core, but in doing so, he received a lethal dose of radiation of 5.1 sieverts, a level almost certain to cause death. The consequences of radiation exposure were known and experienced right from the time of exposure. In the next hours, Daghlian reported severe nausea and vomiting, which are typical of the first stage of ARS. His hands, which were closer to the core, were badly burned. Within the next few days, his condition became much worse since the radiation was killing him from the inside out. Radiation sickness is a cellular process that affects the DNA and cell structures irreversibly. In Daghlian's case, one of the first body systems to shut down was his bone marrow, which is responsible for producing blood cells. This led to anemia, immune system collapse, and internal bleeding. His skin became sore, turned into blisters, and peeled off as radiation injuries penetrated deeper into his tissues and made him suffer. Even when they sought treatment, there was very little that doctors could do to help them. In 1945, knowledge about the impact of radiation was not well developed, and remedies for ARS were scarce. Daghlian's ordeal lasted for 25 days, and he was progressively getting weaker. He suffered from multiple organ failure and continuous pain before dying from his injuries on September 15, 1945. This tragic event in Daghlian's life highlighted the high risks of working with nuclear materials, prompting improvements in safety measures and atomic research. The Demon Core would later claim another victim, physicist Louis Slotin, reinforcing the need for strict procedural guidelines. Daghlian's story is still a sad story of the effects of radiation and the price people pay for scientific advancement.